Mediterranean sun sets over Alexandria, painting the harbor waters gold and crimson, the same colors that will later consume what stands here. But tonight, any night in those centuries, when the great library still breathed scholars walk quietly through marble corridors, their sandals whispering against stone worn smooth by devotion. In their hands, scrolls. In their hearts, hunger for understanding that transcends empire, that outlasts kings. Imagine the building not as ruin, but as living temple to human curiosity. The Mausian, the house of the muses, rises in terraces and courtyards, its gardens carefully tended, its lecture halls echoing with philosophical debate in a dozen languages. Greek mingles with Egyptian, Aramaic with Persian. Scholars come from the edges of the known world, drawn by the rumor of knowledge gathered here, concentrated like honey, distilled into wisdom. What did those shelves hold? Copies of every important text the ancient world produced. Aristotle's treatises, gathered by Ptolemy's collectors, who searched every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor, borrowing books to copy before returning them, or sometimes keeping the originals, sending back the copies. The works of Euclid, who taught geometry in these very halls. Eratosthenes, who measured the circumference of the earth using shadows and mathematics, his calculations eerily accurate, preserved in scrolls that rested in darkness and silence. Medical knowledge from Egyptian priests who had practiced surgery and pharmacy for 3,000 years before Greece was born. Babylonian astronomical charts tracking the movements of planets across decades, centuries, recognizing patterns in the sky that spoke of cosmic order. Texts on engineering and hydraulics, on optics and acoustics, on botany cataloging plants that no longer exist or have since been forgotten. The library was more than collection, it was conversation across time. Scholars compared texts, noted contradictions, sought synthesis. They translated Hebrew scriptures into Greek, creating the Septuagint. They preserved the works of playwrights and poets, philosophers and historians, map makers and mathematicians. 700,000 scrolls, some sources claim, though numbers blur into myth when speaking of Alexandria. Perhaps the exact count matters less than the weight of it. The sense that here, in these rooms, humanity had gathered its accumulated understanding, creating an archive of thought that would guide civilization forward into enlightenment. But fire does not care about enlightenment. The traditional story blames Julius Caesar, 48 BCE, his ships burning in the harbor during his Egyptian campaign, flames spreading to the waterfront warehouses where some scrolls were stored. Others point to later fires. The decree of Theodosius in 391 CE, authorizing the destruction of pagan temples, Christian mobs sweeping through with righteous flame. Still others to the Muslim conquest of 642 CE. Though this tale that the scrolls heated Alexandria's baths for 6 months is likely medieval invention, political mythology dressed as history. Perhaps the truth is slower and sadder than any single catastrophe. Perhaps the library died by degrees. Budgets cut during times of political instability. Scholars leaving for safer cities. Scrolls deteriorating in Alexandria's humid air. Knowledge slipping away like sand through fingers. One manuscript at a time. One generation's negligence compounding the last. What we know with certainty is the absence. The silence where conversation used to be. The questions we cannot answer, because the texts that held their solutions turned to ash or dust, or simply faded, ink returning to invisibility, papyrus crumbling to powder that blew away on Mediterranean winds. Think of what we've lost. Sophocles wrote 123 plays, 7 survive. Euripides wrote 9-2, 18 remain. Aeschylus 70 or 80 plays, only 7 preserved. The mathematics of Pythagoras, known to us only through fragments quoted by later writers. The complete works of Sappho, the poet whose fragments move us still with their intensity and grace 9 books, reduced to quotations, to pieces, to echoes. The engineering treatises that explained how Archimedes built machines that held Roman ships at bay. The medical knowledge that might have prevented centuries of suffering. The astronomical observations that could have accelerated our understanding of the cosmos by 1,000 years. All gone. all silent. Yet something persists. Some scrolls were copied before the fires came, carried to Constantinople, to Baghdad, to monasteries in Ireland, where patient monks preserved what fragments reached them. The library's legacy scattered across the world like seeds, taking root in unexpected soil. Much was lost, but not everything. Not quite everything. And beneath Alexandria's modern streets, beneath buildings and markets, and the accumulated debris of 2 millennia, perhaps some fragment of the library still sleeps. Archaeology continues to excavate, to search, to hope. In 2004, they found what might be lecture halls. Elsewhere, underground chambers that could have been storage vaults. The Mediterranean has claimed much of ancient Alexandria. The royal quarter lies beneath waves. The pharaoh's lighthouse collapsed into the sea. But the sea preserves what it takes. Somewhere in that darkness, in silt and salt water, might rest a sealed chamber, a forgotten vault, scrolls wrapped in waterproof cases by librarians who knew the fire was coming and tried to save what they could. It is probably a dream, but it is a dream that pulls at archaeologists and historians, that funds expeditions and excavations, that refuses to accept that all that wisdom simply vanished. We want to believe in secret chambers, in knowledge waiting to be rediscovered, in the possibility that the conversation is not over, that the library might yet speak again. For now, we sit with the silence. We imagine the scholars walking at dusk through the gardens, discussing philosophy and mathematics as the light fades. We picture the oil lamps being lit one by one in the reading rooms, illuminating scrolls being carefully unrolled, studied, committed to memory by minds that understood they were custodians of something precious and fragile. And we carry forward what they gave us. The idea of the library itself, the notion that knowledge should be gathered and shared, that wisdom is a collective human treasure, that understanding transcends borders and languages, that we are better when we learn from each other, across time, across culture, across the vast distances that separate us from those ancient scholars who walked these halls and dreamed of enlightenment. The library beneath the sand still teaches, even in its absence, especially in its absence. It teaches us what we lose when knowledge burns, when books are banned, when curiosity is punished, when learning is locked away from those who hunger for it. It teaches us to preserve, to copy, to share, to keep alive the conversation that Alexandria began the great human dialogue with mystery, with cosmos, with the questions that have no final answers, but demand we keep asking. The scrolls are gone. The building has crumbled, but the library endures in every library we build, every archive we maintain, every effort to gather and preserve human knowledge. Alexandria was not the end. It was the beginning, the model we still follow, the dream we still chase, the sacred obligation to remember and to share what we remember. Sleep now, with the sound of ancient scribes copying by lamplight, preserving what they could, fighting against the coming dark with ink and papyrus and devoted attention. They lost, but they also won. We remember, we remember. On the Salisbury Plain, where wind moves unobstructed across grassland that has known 10,000 years of human presence, stones stand in a circle. They have stood so long they seem to have grown from the earth itself. Gray megaliths rising like teeth, like fingers, like prayers made solid. This is Stonehenge, and it is waiting. Waiting for what? For whom? These are the questions that tremble in the air around the monument, that echo in the space between the stones, that have troubled human minds since history began recording itself. The stones are older than writing in Britain, older than the wheel in this part of the world, older than bronze. They were ancient when the Druids came, when Celtic tribes named these islands home. They stand in sublime indifference to our theories, our measurements, our desperate need to understand. Let us walk the landscape as it might have appeared in the Neolithic. When the first earthworks were dug, hear not the massive stones yet, but a circular ditch and bank, enclosing space, making it sacred through the simple act of marking boundary. This is 5,000 years ago, when agriculture is still relatively new to Britain, when communities are small and scattered, when the world is populated with spirits, and the boundary between seen and unseen is gossamer thin. Why here? The location seems arbitrary flat plain, no natural harbor, no strategic high ground, no river running close. something called them to this place. Something insisted this ground was holy, worth the investment of labor that defies imagination. Consider the bluestones first, the smaller circle of standing stones, each weighing several tons, quarried from the Preseli Hills in Wales, somehow transported 140 miles across landscape and water, hauled on sledges perhaps, floated on rafts, dragged by hundreds of hands pulling ropes, weeks or months of travel to bring each stone from mountain to plain. And for what? They are not practically useful. They do not defend or shelter. They mark something, a threshold, a temple, a gateway to whatever realm these people believed existed beyond the visible. The larger sarsen stones came later. Maybe 1,000 years later, massive blocks of sandstone from Marlborough Downs, 25 miles away. Some weigh 50 tons. Think about that weight, that mass of stone being moved without metal tools, without wheels, without animals strong enough to pull such loads. Only human bodies, human will, human devotion to purpose we can barely glimpse. They shaped these stones, hammerstones pounding against sandstone for hours, days, weeks, creating the smooth surfaces, the mortise and tenon joints that hold lintels in place. Someone understood engineering, geometry, the distribution of weight. Someone planned this, designed the circle, calculated the positions, ensured that on midsummer sunrise the light would stream through the gap in just this way, and on midwinter sunset it would align just so. Was it a temple? Almost certainly. But temple to what god, what force, what mystery? The sun seems obvious. The alignments point to solar events, the passage of seasons marked in stone. Agricultural societies need to know when to plant, when to harvest. A calendar makes sense, but this seems too grand for mere timekeeping, too sacred for simple agricultural utility. Some scholars suggest healing a Neolithic Lourdes, where the sick journeyed seeking cures, where the stones themselves were believed to hold therapeutic power. Evidence supports this. Many of the burials found nearby show signs of injury or illness. People who traveled far to die or be healed in the presence of these megaliths. Others propose astronomical observatory, a sophisticated calculator of celestial movements, not just sun, but moon, planets, eclipses. The complexity of the alignments supports this. Stonehenge tracks lunar cycles with precision that suggests generations of observation, accumulated knowledge passed down from astronomers we will never name. Or perhaps it was a place of ancestors, a temple to the dead, where the living came to commune with those who had crossed to the shadowlands. The cremated remains, the grave goods, the reverent placement of bodies in the earth around the stones, all speak of a people who understood death as threshold rather than ending, who believed the dead still participated in community, still required respect and remembrance. The most honest answer is probably all of these and none of these. Stonehenge was whatever its builders needed it to be, and their needs were as layered and complex as our own. Sacred space does not have single purpose. It holds what we bring to it: grief, hope, fear, wonder, the aching need to touch something that transcends our brief lives. Stand inside the circle now in imagination on midsummer dawn. The sun crests the horizon, its first rays streaming through the gap between heel stone and uprights, illuminating the central altar stone. Around you, perhaps, a community gathers people in hides and homespun, carrying offerings, singing songs in a language lost before Latin was born. They know why they're here. They know what these stones mean. The knowledge is obvious to them, woven into their understanding of cosmos and spirit and the land itself. But they are dust now, and their certainty has dissolved with them, leaving us these mute stones, these enigmatic megaliths that refuse to yield their secrets, no matter how many ground-penetrating radars we deploy, how many soil samples we analyze, how many theories we propose and revise and abandon. The Druids are not the builders. They came 3,000 years too late. Yet Celtic mythology clings to Stonehenge. Tales of Merlin raising the stones through magic, of giants dancing in a circle turned to stone by enchantment. Perhaps these later stories grope toward truth, that the monument was always already ancient, already mysterious, already beyond ordinary understanding. In the 1960s, an astronomer named Gerald Hawkins proposed that Stonehenge was a computer, its stones positioned to predict eclipses, to track the complex cycles of moon and sun with mathematical precision. His colleagues in archaeology dismissed this too sophisticated, they said, for Neolithic minds. But why? Why assume ancient people were less intelligent than us, less capable of observation, patience, geometric insight? The debate continues, gentle and irresolvable, as theories accumulate like leaves in the ditch that circles the stones. Each generation brings new tools: radiocarbon dating, laser scanning, isotope analysis, and new interpretations. We know more now than ever before about when Stonehenge was built, how it was constructed, where the stones came from, what artifacts were buried nearby. But knowing more has not brought us closer to knowing why, to understanding what moved these people to such extraordinary effort. Perhaps that is itself the gift. Perhaps Stonehenge teaches us humility, reminds us that our knowledge is always partial, always shadowed by what we cannot access. The monument stands as testament to human capacity for planning, cooperation, sustained effort toward goals that transcend individual lives. It also stands as testimony to mystery, to the essential unknowability of minds separated from us by 5,000 years, and the complete dissolution of their culture. At night, under stars that shine as they shone for the Neolithic astronomers, Stonehenge settles into itself. The tourists are gone. The ropes that keep visitors at distance fade into darkness. The stones stand as they have stood, will stand patient and indifferent, and somehow wholly still. You can almost hear it if you listen. The sound of stones being dragged across the plain, the singing of workers moving in rhythm, the chanting of priests at solstice dawn, the weeping of mourners burying their dead in sacred ground, the laughter of children playing in the shadow of megaliths, the whispered prayers in a language that has left no record, no echo, except these stones, these mysterious stones that mark a gate to understanding we cannot quite pass through. Sleep now with the image of the circle at twilight, stones darkening against the last light, the plain stretching away in all directions, empty and full, silent and singing. The gate of orphaned stars remains open, waiting for us to remember what we knew before we forgot, to understand what the stones have been telling us all along. If only we could learn again to listen. 400 symbols, beautifully arranged, carved into soft soapstone seals the size of postage stamps. A bull with a single horn, enigmatic and serene. A figure seated in yogic posture, surrounded by animals. Geometric patterns that might be letters, or might be art, or might be both. This is the Indus Valley script, and it is locked as thoroughly as any treasure vault, more mysterious than hieroglyphics ever were, more resistant to translation than linear. Be the civilization that created these symbols flourished along the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, from roughly 3300 to 1300 BC. They built cities that astound us still with their sophistication. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dhalavira, Lothal. Urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, laid out in precise grids, equipped with the world's first known sanitation systems, covered drains running beneath every street, public and private wells, bathrooms in individual houses with sophisticated drainage. They were engineers of water, these Indus people. They understood hydraulics, city planning, public health in ways that would not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. Yet they left no palaces, no temples on the Egyptian or Mesopotamian scale, no obvious structures of autocratic power. Their cities speak of organization without ostentation, of hierarchy without grandiosity. What kind of society builds this way? The seals give us glimpses, frustrating and partial. They're small objects, usually square, carved in intaglio so they could be pressed into clay or wax, leaving raised impressions, ancient signatures, perhaps, or official stamps marking goods, claiming ownership, authenticating documents. They've been found throughout the region, and even beyond in Mesopotamian cities, evidence of trade networks spanning the ancient Near East. The Indus Valley exported cotton cloth, carnelian beads, perhaps spices and timber. What did they import in return? Ideas, techniques, stories. The inscriptions are brief, typically 5 symbols, rarely more than 20. Too short for us to detect patterns with certainty, to recognize grammar or syntax, or the structure that would unlock meaning. Scholars have tried everything, assuming the script is logographic like Chinese, phonetic like alphabets, a hybrid like Egyptian hieroglyphics. They've applied statistical analysis, computer algorithms, linguistic comparisons with every language family from Dravidian to Indo-European to language isolates with no known relatives. Nothing works. Or rather, everything works a little, nothing works completely. The script remains stubbornly opaque, guarding its secrets with the patience of stone. What did they write about? These careful craftsmen carving symbols into soapstone. Were the seals bureaucratic recording quantities of grain, claiming authority over shipments of copper? Were they religious, invoking gods or spirits whose names we will never know? Were they personal, names of merchants or kings, or simply proud citizens claiming this belongs to me? The imagery on the seals tantalizes. The unicorn bull appears on almost half of all seals, clearly significant. But how? Was it a clan symbol, a deity, a mythological creature? Or perhaps not a unicorn at all, but a profile view of a two-horned animal? We cannot ask. We cannot know. The figure in yogic posture, surrounded by animals, has been called Proto-Shiva, suggesting continuity between Indus religion and later Hinduism. Perhaps, or perhaps this is us imposing later traditions onto earlier mysteries, seeing what we expect rather than what is actually there. The figure might be a priest, a deity, a mythological hero, or simply a human in a posture of meditation or ritual. The animals surrounding him might be worshippers, companions, or purely decorative. Every interpretation is speculation layered upon silence. Walking through the ruins of Mohenjo-daro today, you can trace the city's careful planning. The Great Bath, a large public bathing area with waterproofed bricks and elaborate drainage. The granary where wheat was stored in quantities that speak of surplus, stability, administrative organization. The residential blocks with their private wells and bathroom facilities. The wide main streets running north-south, east-west, in perfect orthogonal precision. But nowhere are there hieroglyphic panels explaining who built this, why they built it, what they believed, how they governed themselves. No Rosetta Stone has emerged to crack the code. No bilingual inscription bridges the gap between Indus script and the Brahmi script that emerged in India over 1,000 years after the Indus cities were abandoned. The written language of these people is an island, isolated in time, with no ancestors we can identify and no descendants we can trace. This is the peculiar tragedy of the Indus Valley civilization. They left us everything except the key to understanding what they left. We have their cities, their tools, their pottery, their seals, their toys, yes, toys, including small carts and what might be early dice. We can trace their trade routes, reconstruct their diet, admire their metallurgy and their urban planning. But we cannot read their thoughts. We cannot hear their voices. Why did it end? The cities were abandoned gradually, over centuries. No signs of invasion or catastrophe. No evidence of fire or earthquake destroying the urban centers. Instead, slow decline. Buildings not maintained, pottery becoming cruder, the careful grid system breaking down, population declining, shifting eastward toward the Ganges Valley. Climate change seems probable, the Ghaggar-Hakra River system drying up, monsoon patterns shifting, the agricultural surplus that supported urban life dwindling. People adapted, moved, changed their ways. The cities were not destroyed. They were simply left behind, abandoned to wind and sand and the patient accumulation of dust. And with the cities went the script. Within a few generations, no one remembered how to read the symbols. The knowledge was not violently suppressed or deliberately destroyed. It was simply forgotten. The way so much is forgotten when necessity changes, when survival demands adaptation, when the contexts that gave meaning to old knowledge dissolve. Today, the seals rest in museums, Pakistan, India, Britain, scattered through institutions around the world. They sit behind glass, beautifully displayed, meticulously catalogued, completely inscrutable. Scholars still work on decipherment, still hope for breakthrough, still apply new methods and technologies. AI analysis, statistical modeling, comparative linguistics. Each new tool brings new hope. And so far, each new tool has foundered on the same fundamental problem. Too little text, too much time, no bridge to languages we understand. Perhaps it is fitting. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, some voices to stay silent. The Indus Valley people built their cities, lived their lives, loved and grieved and died, participated in the grand human project of creating meaning in a universe that offers none inherently. They did this without leaving us their story in words we can read, without explaining themselves, without begging for our understanding or approval. They simply were, and now they are not, and these symbols remain, beautiful and enigmatic, holding their secrets like seeds that will not germinate, like doors that will not open, like whispers in a language that dissolved in air before our ancestors learned to write down theirs. In the silence of the script, perhaps we can find a kind of peace. Not everything needs to be known. Not every mystery needs solution. Sometimes the reverent acknowledgement of what we cannot grasp is itself a form of wisdom, recognizing that human understanding has limits. That time claims more than it preserves. That absence can be as profound as presence. Sleep now, with the image of the unicorn bull gazing calmly from its seal, surrounded by symbols that once meant everything to someone and now mean nothing to anyone, or rather mean mystery itself, mean the vast, unknowable span of human experience that leaves no clear record, that slips through our grasping fingers like water, like sand, like the 5,000 years that separate us from the last person who could read these symbols and understand what they were trying to say. In the British Museum, behind protective glass, rests a circle of polished volcanic stone, black as midnight, smooth as still water. It is roughly the size of a hand, slightly convex, its surface unmarred except by the passage of centuries and the breath of those who gazed into its darkness, seeking visions. This is John Dee's scrying mirror, and it has looked into realms we cannot map, has reflected scenes we cannot verify, has been both window and lie, both portal and delusion, depending on who tells the story. Obsidian forms when volcanic lava cools rapidly, creating glass natural elemental, carrying in its substance the memory of fire and transformation. The Aztecs prized obsidian, crafted it into blades sharper than steel, into jewelry and decorative objects, and into mirrors believed to allow communication with the divine. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god, was said to carry such a mirror, to see through it into human hearts, to know what was hidden, what was feared, what was desired. How this particular mirror traveled from Mesoamerica to Elizabethan England is unclear, perhaps taken as plunder by conquistadors, purchased by collectors fascinated with New World curiosities, passing through unknown hands before arriving in the possession of John Dee, mathematician, astronomer, occult philosopher, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I.D., was not a charlatan, or at least not merely a charlatan. He was a serious scholar, a man who saw no contradiction between mathematics and magic, who believed that through proper study and technique, one could communicate with angelic beings, could access hidden knowledge, could peer beyond the veil that separates material reality from spiritual realms. In his library at Mortlake, surrounded by one of the largest book collections in England, over 4,000 volumes, on subjects from navigation to alchemy to sacred geometry. He conducted experiments in communication with what he called angels. His method required the mirror, or alternatively, a crystal stone, both objects serving as focal points, as portals through which non-physical entities could manifest or communicate. Dee himself did not claim to see visions directly. For that, he needed a scryer, someone with the psychic sensitivity to perceive what appeared in the reflective surfaces. His most famous collaborator was Edward Kelly, a man with questionable past, possible criminal history, and undeniable charisma. Together, over several years in the 1580s, Dee and Kelly conducted sessions of spiritual conferencing. Kelly would gaze into the obsidian mirror or the crystal while Dee recorded what Kelly reported seeing and hearing. What emerged were conversations with entities who identified themselves as angels Uriel, Gabriel, Raphael, and others with stranger names: Madame, Galva, Nalvage. These beings, according to Kelly's visions, and Dee's meticulous notes revealed a new language, the Enochian tongue, which they claimed was the original language spoken by God to Adam, the language of creation itself. The Enochian language is genuinely strange, internally consistent enough to have grammar and syntax, to be learnable, yet completely unlike any known human language family. Scholars have debated its origin ever since. Was it genuine divine revelation? Was it Kelly's elaborate invention? Was it drawn from Dee's subconscious, constructed through their collaborative sessions? A shared hallucination taking linguistic form. What the angels told them was often unsettling. They received instructions for complex magical rituals, for creating elaborate tables and sigils, for conjuring and binding spirits. They were given prophecies, some of which seemed to come true in the flexible way prophecies do, vague enough to fit multiple outcomes, and they were told secrets about the nature of reality, about hierarchies of angels and demons, about the structure of the cosmos, information that Dee recorded with the same careful attention he applied to his mathematical calculations and astronomical observations. The mirror itself, did it show them anything? Or was it simply a focus, a psychological tool that allowed access to subconscious or transpersonal material? Looking into polished obsidian, especially in candlelight, can induce a trance state, a softening of normal consciousness where imagination becomes vivid, where internal images project outward and seem external, objective, real. Perhaps that is all it was. Kelly's fertile imagination, his psychological instability, or his deliberate fraud, projected onto the mirror's dark surface and interpreted by Dee's desperate need to believe in realms beyond the material, in knowledge beyond what books and reason could provide. The Elizabethan age was one of expansion, geographical, intellectual, spiritual. The new world had been discovered, revealing that the ancients' maps of the earth were incomplete. Why not also new realms of knowledge, new dimensions of reality, new ways of knowing? Or perhaps, and this is where we enter uncertainty, perhaps the mirror did show something. Perhaps there are realms adjacent to ours. Perhaps consciousness can extend beyond skull and synapses. Perhaps certain objects or practices can facilitate access to dimensions we have forgotten how to perceive in our modern, rationalized, materialist age. Perhaps the mirror was exactly what Dee believed it to be, a tool for seeing beyond the visible. We cannot know. The mirror sits in its case, dark and silent, offering no answers. Its surface reflects only what is placed before it. Museum lights, the faces of visitors who peer into it, hoping for some echo of mystery, some frisson of the uncanny. It is just volcanic glass, formed in fire, polished by hands, carried across ocean. Used in ceremonies we can reconstruct only through written records that themselves might be fiction or delusion, or something we have no adequate word for. Other obsidian mirrors exist, other scrying stones, other reflective surfaces used throughout history for divination, water in dark bowls, polished metal, crystals, even pools of ink. The practice crosses cultures. Chinese fortune tellers, Persian mystics, Amazonian shamans, Celtic priests all developed techniques for reading visions in reflective surfaces, for accessing hidden knowledge or future sight or communication with spirits. Is there something about the act of gazing into darkness, into depths that have no bottom, into surfaces that reflect and distort and create ambiguity? Is there something about this that opens doors in consciousness? Or is it purely psychological, a technique for silencing the critical mind and allowing the pattern-seeking, story-making aspects of consciousness to operate without censorship? Modern psychology might call it scrying a form of active imagination, a deliberate cultivation of hypnagogic states, the use of Rorschach-like ambiguity to externalize internal content. This does not make it less real as an experience, less valuable as a technique for accessing parts of the psyche that rational thought keeps locked away. But neither does it confirm the existence of angels or spirits or realms beyond matter. Dee died in poverty, his library destroyed by mob violence, his reputation in ruins, considered by many to be a madman or a dupe. Kelly possibly died in prison, or possibly faked his death, and disappeared. The record is unclear. The Enochian language they revealed or created lives on, used by ceremonial magicians who believe it holds power, who perform the rituals de-recorded, who invoke the entities that spoke through the mirror. And the mirror itself rests in London, an artifact of ambiguity, belonging equally to history of science, history of magic, history of delusion, history of sincere inquiry into mysteries that remain mysterious despite our technologies and methodologies and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Look into it in imagination. See your own face reflected darkly in its obsidian curve. See candlelight flickering, making the surface seem to move, to have depth where there is only solid stone. See, perhaps, a flicker of something else movement in the darkness, pattern in the grain of the volcanic glass, suggestion of form that might be pareidolia, or might be vision, or might be something we have no category for, something that exists in the space between what is real and what is perceived, what is objective and what is experienced. The mirror offers no answers, only reflection. And in that reflection, only questions. What did they see, those Elizabethan magicians? What were they really doing in their sessions of angelic communication? What parts of the human mind or soul or consciousness did they access through ritual and obsidian and desperate longing to know what is unknowable? Sleep now with the image of dark mirror in candlelight, with the sound of Dee's quill scratching on paper, recording visions, trying to capture in language what Kelly saw, or claimed to see, or hallucinated, or genuinely perceived in realms beyond normal sight. Sleep with the possibility that mystery is real, that there are more things in heaven and earth than our philosophies account for, that sometimes the old ways knew something we have forgotten in our certainty, our materialism, our insistence that only the measurable is real. The mirror waits. It has waited centuries. It will wait centuries more. And in its darkness, it holds whatever we bring to it. Hope, fear, curiosity, skepticism, longing for meaning, for contact with the divine, for proof that consciousness is more than neurons firing, that existence includes dimensions we cannot see, but somehow, sometimes, can touch. In the heart of Cambodia, where monsoon rains feed forests of impossible green, where humidity hangs heavy as water and morning mist rises like ghosts. Stones dream of glory. This is Angkor Wat, temple complex beyond imagining. City that once held 1,000,000 souls, now surrendered to the patient hunger of roots and vines, and the slow dissolution that nature imposes on all human ambition. Approach it first from a distance, as pilgrims did when the temple was young, when its towers still gleamed with gold leaf and sacred fires burned at altars where priests made offerings to gods who have not entirely departed. You would see it rising above the jungle canopy. 5 lotus-bud towers arranged in cosmic diagram, the central spire reaching toward heaven, the whole structure reflecting in the vast rectangular moat that surrounds it, water and stone and sky creating unity, teaching without words about the nature of existence, reflection, illusion, reality. The temple was built in the 12th century by King Suryavarman II, dedicated originally to Vishnu, later adapted to Buddhist worship when the kingdom's faith shifted. It is not merely large, though it is vast beyond easy comprehension. The largest religious monument in the world, but intricate. Every surface carved, every wall telling stories in bas-relief that run for hundreds of meters, depicting battles from the Mahabharata, scenes from the Ramayana, the churning of the ocean of milk, where gods and demons sought immortality. Walk the galleries in imagination. Your bare feet touch stone worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims, monks, tourists, devotees. Light filters through windows, creating patterns on carved walls where apsaras dance in frozen grace celestial nymphs. Hundreds of them, each unique, each beautiful, each holding a posture of perfect balance between movement and stillness. They wear elaborate headdresses, jewelry rendered in stone with such delicate precision you can see individual beads, individual flowers. Their faces serene, their gestures mudras of blessing and welcome and sacred invitation. The galleries wind deeper into shadow, into cool silence, where even modern visitors lower their voices, sensing the holiness that persists despite tourism, despite the passage of empires, despite the fact that no one alive worships here in the way the temple was designed for, with the rituals it was built to house. In the central sanctuary, at the heart of the temple, stairs rise steeply toward the uppermost level, toward the central tower. These stairs are deliberately steep, almost vertical, requiring those who climb to do so with humility, hands and feet, ascending not as casual visitors, but as supplicants approaching the realm of the divine. At the top, the wind moves freely, offering views across the temple complex, across the jungle, toward other temple mountains top Rome, Bayon, Precon, each another marvel, another impossible construction that required not just labor, but vision, not just resources, but faith. But Angkor Wat is only one temple in a city that sprawled across hundreds of square kilometers. The Khmer Empire at its height controlled much of Southeast Asia, grew wealthy on rice cultivation, supported by the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering system of the medieval world. They built enormous reservoirs barrages that caught monsoon rains, stored water through dry season, fed irrigation canals that allowed multiple rice harvests per year, generating surplus that supported not just the capital, but military campaigns, long-distance trade, and the massive construction projects that left us these stone marvels. The city was alive with color, with sound, with the bustle of market and palace and monastery. Wooden houses on stilts lined canals, much as they do in rural Cambodia today. Silk merchants traded with Chinese ships. Indian traders brought spices and ideas. The royal palace glittered with gold and precious stones. Daily life pulsed with the rhythms of agriculture, ceremony, family, ambition, love, grief. All the universal human experiences played out in a specifically Khmer key. But wooden buildings rot. Thatch roofs dissolve. What remains is the stone temples and a few bridges, the permanent expressions of religious devotion, while the everyday city has returned to earth and been reclaimed by jungle. And the jungle here is particularly relentless. Ta Prohm Temple shows this most dramatically. Massive tree roots flow over and through the stone structures, creating surreal fusion of living and built, natural and artificial. Strangler figs and silk kitten trees have grown for centuries from seeds that landed in cracks, roots finding moisture, growing, splitting stones apart even as they hold the broken structures together. Remove the trees, and the temples would collapse. Leave the trees, and they continue their slow destruction. The conservators face impossible choices. The trees are beautiful, though, in their destructive embrace. Roots thick as elephant trunks cascade over doorways, looking like frozen waterfalls of wood, creating patterns that seem almost deliberate, as if the jungle is not destroying, but redecorating, adding organic architecture to human stone. In the dappled light filtering through the canopy, the effect is otherworldly, more Tolkien than historical sight, more dream than documentation. Why was Angkor abandoned? The simplest answer is ecological collapse. The hydraulic system that sustained the city became its weakness. Deforestation for building materials and agriculture, combined with climate shifts that made monsoons less predictable, meant the barrays could not be maintained. Silt accumulated, canals choked with vegetation. The delicate balance between too much water and too little broke down. Without reliable rice surplus, the population could not be sustained. People drifted away toward the coast, toward other centers of power. There were also invasions. Thai armies sacked Angkor in 1431, but the city was likely already in decline, its infrastructure failing, its economic base eroding. The coup de grace came not from sword, but from entropy, from the accumulated failures of maintenance, from the slow realization that what had worked for centuries was no longer viable. But Angkor Wat itself never completely emptied. Buddhist monks continued to worship there even as the empire crumbled, even as the jungle claimed the surrounding structures. Pilgrims still came, though fewer, though the roads were overgrown, though the great irrigation works had turned to swamp and tangle. The temple endured, never quite abandoned, never quite forgotten, maintained enough to prevent total collapse, sacred enough to deserve care, even when resources were scarce. European explorers discovered Angkor in the 19th century, though of course local people knew it was there all along. The French began conservation efforts, clearing some jungle stabilizing structures, documenting the inscriptions and architecture. Modern archaeology continues this work, using laser scanning to reveal the full extent of the city, hidden beneath forest cover roads and neighborhoods. More temples, the vast system of canals and reservoirs that made it all possible. What we see today is fragment, carefully curated, partially restored. We see the greatest hits Angkor Wat, Bayon with its serene stone faces, Top Rome with its photogenic tree roots. But we do not see the full city as it was, cannot imagine the bustle and noise, the smell of incense and cooking fires, the sound of Sanskrit chanting and marketplace bargaining, the visual riot of colored silk and painted wood, gold leaf catching tropical sun. We see instead the skeleton, beautiful in its way, instructive in its decay. We see what stone can preserve and what it cannot form, but not color, structure, but not life, the permanent, but not the perishable. And we see nature's patience, the way forest waits, always waits, ready to reclaim what was taken from it, to cover human ambition with green silence, to grow roots through cracks, until the grandest monuments become merely substrate for living things that know nothing of empire or devotion or the aesthetic achievements of 12th century Khmer architecture. There is strange comfort in this, the knowledge that nature endures, that the jungle will outlast our civilizations, that what we build with such effort will eventually return to earth and forest, and the patient cycling of growth and decay. Angkor teaches impermanence more effectively than any sermon, shows us how even the greatest human works are temporary, how stone itself eventually bows to root and rain, and the inevitable processes of dissolution. Sleep now, with the image of sunlight filtering green through jungle canopy, illuminating apsaras dancing on ancient walls, tree roots holding broken temples in their wooden embrace, monks in orange robes walking meditation around the central sanctuary, continuing practices that predate the buildings, that will continue after the buildings have finally fallen, keeping alive something essential even as the forms change, even as the jungle breathes its patient breath over everything humans build, claiming it slowly gently, returning it to the wild from which it was briefly taken. Descend with me now into darkness, not the darkness of night, which can be relieved by fire, but the profound darkness of deep cave, where sunlight has never reached, where the concept of day has no meaning, where stone has rested in absolute black for millennia, until human hands brought flame and briefly pushed the shadows back. This is Chauvet Cave in southern France, sealed by rockfall 30,000 years ago. Its entrance hidden until 1994, when 3 spelunkers found the way in and discovered what waited in that preserved darkness. Paintings of such sophistication, such beauty, such confident execution, that they rewrote everything we thought we knew about Paleolithic art. The horses gallop in herds, their legs arranged to suggest motion, to capture the flowing movement of running animals. The lions hunt in coordinated pride, muscles rippling beneath fur rendered with careful shading. The rhinoceroses and mammoths and cave bears exist not as crude stick figures, but as living creatures, observed with the keen eye of people who knew these animals intimately, who studied their forms, their movements, who understood how light falls on curved surfaces, how to use the natural contours of the cave wall to suggest three-dimensional shape. These are not primitive scratchings. This is art, sophisticated and intentional, created by minds fully human, fully capable of abstract thought and aesthetic judgment, and the kind of vision that can translate observed reality into symbolic form and make that translation beautiful. But walk deeper, past the spectacular panels in the first chambers, into passages that narrow, that twist, that require crawling on hands and knees, that show no signs of habitation, no debris of daily life, no soot from cooking fires or remains of meals. These deep chambers were not living spaces. No one made their home here in the dark. Instead, they came specifically to create images, to perform rituals, to make music in this resonant belly of earth. Because the caves were chosen, we now know, not just for their walls, but for their acoustics. Certain chambers amplify sound in specific frequency, ranges the range of human voice, particularly male voice, particularly chanting voice. Where the paintings cluster most densely, sound behaves most interestingly. Strike a stone against the wall where the horses run, and the cave rings like a drum. Sing where the lions hunt, and the sound wraps around you, reflected from multiple surfaces, creating the illusion of many voices, of presences beyond the visible. Did they sing as they painted? Did they chant, beat drums, play bone flutes? Yes, bone flutes, because we found them, carved from vulture wing bones with careful finger holes, still playable after 35,000 years, still capable of producing pentatonic scales that sound eerily familiar, eerily beautiful, eerily sad. Try to imagine the ceremony. A group enters the cave with torches made from animal fat and twisted plant fiber, the flames casting enormous dancing shadows that make the painted animals seem to move, seem to breathe. The flute player begins, a simple melody, mournful or ecstatic or something we have no word for. Others join with voice, with percussion on the resonant walls, with the stamp of feet on stone floor. The music builds, the chamber amplifies it, creates overtones and undertones, frequencies that throb in the chest cavity, that resonate in bone, that shift consciousness into states we might call trance, but they would have had a different word for, or perhaps no word, perhaps just the experience itself, unmediated by language. And in this altered state, lit by uncertain firelight, surrounded by images of the powerful animals they hunted and feared and respected, perhaps they contacted something spirits of the beasts, ancestors dwelling in the stone, the great mysteries that underlie existence, whatever forces they believed animated the world and required propitiation, honor, relationship. The handprints move me most, dozens of them, all through the cave's hands pressed against the wall, pigment blown around them through reed or bone tube, leaving the negative image, the shadow of a hand. This is the most direct connection we have to Paleolithic people. Their hands, the exact size and shape and proportions of their palms and fingers, preserved in ochre on limestone. Hold your own hand up to the image. Match palm to palm across 30,000 years. feel the impossible intimacy of it. This person stood where you stand, felt what you feel, was human in precisely the way you are human, with the same capacity for wonder, fear, love, imagination, the same need to leave a mark, to say, I was here, I existed, I mattered. But we cannot know their names, cannot know if they were shamans or artists or the Paleolithic equivalent of teenagers sneaking away from camp to make trouble, cannot know if the handprints were ritual or play, sacred or profane, significant or casual, cannot know what songs they sang, what stories they told about the animals they painted, what meanings they invested in the act of creating these images. Language existed by then. Humans have been anatomically modern for at least 200,000 years, and language capacity is fundamental to human cognition, necessary for the kind of complex cooperation that allowed our species to spread across the globe. But it was oral language only, leaving no record, every word spoken dissolving instantly in air. The paintings are their words, perhaps, visual language expressing what mattered, the animals they lived among, the hands that made the marks, the mystery they felt in darkness and in firelight, in the resonant chambers where sound became strange, became numinous, became the voice of the earth itself speaking back to them. Modern researchers bring spectrometers and chemical analysis, radiocarbon dating and photogrammetry, laser scanning and acoustic modeling. We measure everything measurable, the age of the pigments, the mineral composition of the ochre, the acoustic properties of each chamber, the frequency response of the resonant walls. We create 3D models and detailed studies, publish papers, and make documentaries. Try to understand through science what was created through something that science cannot quite reach, the ecstatic, the sacred, the attempt to touch mystery through image and sound, and the transformation of consciousness that happens in deep darkness when fire and music work their ancient magic. The caves are closed now, most of them. Too many visitors were changing the delicate atmospheric balance, introducing moisture and bacteria, damaging paintings that survived 30 millennia in perfect stasis. So we visit replicas instead, exact copies that preserve the experience without risking the original. It's not quite the same. The replicas lack the aura of authenticity, the knowledge that these walls actually knew Paleolithic firelight, that these images were actually created by human hands 40,000 years ago. But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps the originals should rest in darkness, visited only by researchers with strict protocols, preserved for future generations who might bring new tools, new understanding, new questions we haven't thought to ask yet. Perhaps the paintings serve best not as tourist attractions, but as what they always were: sacred objects, threshold markers between ordinary reality and something deeper, presences that dwell in dark waiting for those with patience to approach them with reverence. Sleep now, with the sound of bone flute in your ears, with the image of horses running forever on stone walls, with the feeling of your hand matching palm to palm with ancestors separated from you by unimaginable spans of time, yet intimate as breath, as similar as the fact that both of you stood in darkness and reached out to touch the wall, to leave a mark, to say without words what words cannot say, that we are here, that we matter, that we touch what is sacred even if we cannot name it, that music and image and the resonance of stone chambers held something important before language existed to describe what that importance was. The sound before language still echoes if we quiet ourselves enough to hear it. The image before writing still speaks if we soften our gaze and let the firelight flicker, let the shadows dance. Let ourselves remember what we knew before we forgot, before we became so certain that meaning requires words, that truth requires proof, that the only real knowledge is the knowledge we can measure and record and preserve in forms that deteriorate more quickly than the ochre on the cave walls, that matter less than the anonymous hands pressed against stone by people who are gone, who left us only these shadows, these songs, these paintings that survive because they were made with care in darkness, with reverence, with the understanding that some truths can only be expressed in sacred chambers, where light is temporary, and sound itself becomes the voice of mystery. From the depths of the Mediterranean, from a shipwreck resting in twilight waters off the coast of Antikythera, divers in 1901 brought up fragments of bronze corroded green with thyme and salt. Among the broken statues and amphorae, the expected treasures of an ancient vessel, they found something unexpected, a lump of metal that, when examined, revealed gears. Precise, intricate gears meshed together, some as small as coins, part of a mechanism that had no business existing in the ancient world as historians understood it. It took decades to comprehend what they had found. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, was initially dismissed or explained away as medieval astrolabe somehow contaminating the ancient wreck. But the radiocarbon dating was clear, the pottery and coins definitive. This device came from approximately 100 BCE, made by hands that lived when the Roman Republic was transitioning to empire, when Cleopatra ruled Egypt, when the Colosseum was still a century from being imagined. What could ancient Greeks possibly need with gears? The question reveals our assumptions more than any ancient limitation. We imagine the classical world as white marble and philosophy, forgetting that Greek mathematics was sophisticated enough to calculate the circumference of the earth, that Greek engineers built mechanical wonders like the steam-powered devices of Hero of Alexandria, that Greek astronomy tracked planetary motions with precision that would not be surpassed until Copernicus. X-ray analysis, modern tomography, patient reconstruction from hundreds of fragments. Slowly, the mechanism revealed itself. It is a calculator, an analog computer designed to predict astronomical positions. Turn a crank on the side, and the gears move, modeling the motions of sun and moon, possibly the 5 planets known to antiquity, calculating eclipses decades in advance, predicting the dates of Olympic Games, tracking the complex cycles of lunar and solar years with mathematical elegance that speaks of profound understanding. The main dial shows the solar year, divided into the Egyptian calendar's 12 months. Subsidiary dials track lunar phases, predict solar and lunar eclipses using the Saros cycle, a 223-month period after which eclipses repeat with remarkable regularity, known to Babylonian astronomers, and incorporated here in bronze and calculation. Another dial marks the Olympiad cycle, the four-year rhythm that structured Greek timekeeping and athletic competition. The mechanism incorporated differential gearing, a technique historians believed was invented in the 16th century. It used epicyclic gearing to model the irregular motions of the moon, accounting for its elliptical orbit with a precision that suggests the maker understood lunar theory at levels we thought required medieval Arabic astronomers to discover. The pointer work remains accurate, the mathematical modeling sound, the engineering exquisite. Who built this? We have no name, no signature, no dedicatory inscription. The style of lettering on the surviving fragments suggests Rhodes or Corinth, cities known for astronomical study and mechanical arts. Perhaps it was crafted in the school of Posidonius, a philosopher-scientist who worked in Rhodes, and whose writings, now lost, apparently described mechanical devices modeling celestial motions. Perhaps it was Hipparchus himself, the greatest astronomer of antiquity, who calculated the precession of the equinoxes and compiled star catalogues. We know he worked in Rhodes around the right time, or perhaps it was an anonymous craftsman, extraordinarily skilled, working from astronomical tables compiled by others, translating mathematical understanding into bronze reality, creating an instrument that would allow ship captains to navigate, that would help merchants schedule travel by favorable lunar phases, that would predict eclipses and thus remove some of the terror from natural events that earlier ages interpreted as divine displeasure. The shipwreck context is itself suggestive. The vessel was carrying luxury goods, wine, statues, glassware, likely bound from the eastern Mediterranean toward Rome. The mechanism was probably not the ship's navigation tool, but cargo, valuable property being transported for sale or as gift. This implies not a unique object, but a type of object, one sophisticated enough to command high prices, practical enough to justify production. If one mechanism traveled as cargo, others must have existed, must have been sold, used, treasured. Where are they? Lost, corroded beyond recognition, melted down for the bronze, discarded when broken and the knowledge to repair them disappeared. The Antikythera mechanism survived only because the sea claimed it quickly, burying it in silt where anaerobic conditions slowed corrosion. Other mechanisms might rest on other seafloors, or might have crumbled to unrecognizable lumps in museums, catalogued as bronze fragments by curators who had no context for understanding what they were seeing. This is the disturbing implication. How much have we lost? What other technologies? What other achievements? What other examples of ancient ingenuity have vanished completely, leaving us to underestimate what was possible, to draw maps of human capability that are incomplete, misleading. The Dark Ages were dark partly because of what was lost. Libraries burned, knowledge hoarded, and then forgotten when the hoarders died. Technologies abandoned when the economic and social systems that supported them collapsed. The Antikythera mechanism proves that timeline of progress we teach is wrong, or at least incomplete. Technological sophistication is not linear. Civilizations can achieve remarkable things and then lose the capacity to recreate them, can fall back to simpler technologies, not because they're primitive, but because complexity requires maintenance, requires apprentices learning from masters, requires economic surplus to support specialization, requires political stability to preserve knowledge across generations. The mechanism sits now in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, fragments displayed behind glass, the gears visible in CT scans, the function understood after a century of study. But it retains its power to shock, to remind us that ancient people were not simpler than us, not less intelligent, not less capable of sophisticated thought. They simply had different tools, different materials, different problems to solve, and they solved them brilliantly sometimes, creating devices like this calculator that compressed astronomical knowledge into portable bronze, that brought the the heavens down to human scale, that let merchants and sailors plan their lives by the cycles of the cosmos rendered comprehensible, predictable, useful. What else could they do? What other marvels did they build that we've forgotten or never knew? What knowledge disappeared when the last person who understood died without passing on the learning? When the last mechanism broke and no one remained who could repair it? When the economic system that supported such craftsmanship collapsed, and necessity drove everyone back to simpler, more robust technologies that could survive periods of chaos? We cannot know. We have only this one witness, this single survivor speaking from the seafloor, telling us that our assumptions are wrong, that the ancient world was more capable than we imagined, that between what we know they achieved and what they might have achieved stretches a vast gap filled with objects that dissolved in time's acid, leaving no trace, no testimony, no proof except the haunting sense that we've lost more than we can measure. Sleep now, with the image of bronze gears turning, calculating eclipses, tracking moon phases, modeling the cosmos in portable form, made by hands that understood both mathematics and metalwork, both theory and practice, both the abstract patterns of heavenly motion and the concrete requirements of building machines to model those patterns in bronze, and precise engineering. Sleep with the knowledge that human capability has always been greater than we acknowledge, that genius appears in every age if conditions allow it, that we are not the pinnacle, but simply the current chapter in a longer story of intelligence and ingenuity reaching toward understanding, making tools to grasp what cannot be held, building mechanisms to calculate what cannot be directly seen, leaving behind fragments that future ages will puzzle over, trying to reconstruct what was known, what was lost, what survives only in corroded metal pulled from the depths where it rested, waiting to be found, waiting to remind us that mystery lives in what we've forgotten as much as in what we've never known. In the churchyard of St. Dyganes in Lanjourny, Wales, a yew tree grows, or rather, has grown for how long, no one can say with certainty. 4,000 years is the conservative estimate, 5,000 is plausible. The tree was ancient before the church was built, was sacred before Christianity arrived, has stood through the entirety of British history and beyond, back into the Bronze Age when people first worked metal, first buried their dead beneath earth mounds, first marked sacred spaces with standing stones. The yew itself looks like a remnant of deep time made vegetable. Its trunk, if it can be called a trunk, has hollowed completely. The heartwood rotted away, or perhaps never forming in the center. The living tissue only a thin cylinder of bark and sapwood through which nutrients flow. The tree has fragmented into separate stems, each massive, each gnarled and twisting, bark fissured into deep crevices where moss grows, where insects make homes, where birds nest in spring. The branches spread wide, creating a canopy of dark evergreen foliage, dropping the red berries that give the tree its other name, the death tree, because nearly every part is poisonous. But the yew does not die, cannot die, or will not. When a branch touches the ground, it roots, creating a daughter tree that remains connected to the parent. Over centuries, a single yew can generate a grove of itself, all one organism though appearing as many, all sharing roots beneath the soil, all part of the same ancient vegetable consciousness that persists through storms and droughts and human attempts to categorize, to understand, to count its years. Sacred to the Druids, these trees that much seems clear, though the Druids left no written records, and what we think we know of their practices comes from Roman sources that might be hostile propaganda, or might preserve genuine observation. The yew groves were temple groves, places where the barrier between worlds grew thin, where priests performed rituals we can only speculate about, where death and life intertwined as obviously as they do in the tree itself, poisonous and evergreen, ancient and always renewing. When Christianity came to Britain, the missionaries were wise enough not to destroy the yew groves, but to build churches within them, to absorb rather than replace the sanctity already recognized. St. Dygan's stands where a church has stood for perhaps 1,400 years, but the yew predates it by millennia. The worshippers changed, The prayers changed. The language and theology and cosmology changed. But the tree endured, sacred still, marking the same ground as holy, though the names of the holy powers have shifted from Celtic deities to Christian saints, to the general numinousness that settles over any place that has been considered sacred for long enough. Other yews scatter through British churchyards. The Fortingall yew in Scotland, possibly 5,000 years old. The yews of St. Synods and St. Mary's, and dozens of village churches where the trees dwarf the buildings, predate them by centuries or millennia, stand witness to generations of burial and baptism, marriage and mourning. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Yews mark sacred space, have always marked sacred space, their evergreen foliage suggesting immortality, their poison suggesting death, their longevity proving that some living things transcend human timescales, exist in relationship to deep time that makes our individual lives seem like mayfly flickerings. In medieval England, yew wood was prized for longbows dense, flexible, able to store and release energy with efficiency that made the English longbow devastatingly effective. The 100 Years' War was won partly with yew. Trees felled and shaped into weapons that changed warfare, that allowed common archers to kill armored knights, that democratized violence in ways that eroded feudalism. How many ancient yews died to make those bows? How many sacred groves were harvested for military necessity? Their timber transformed from temple to weapon. Yet enough survived, protected by their churchyard locations or their remote positions in mountain valleys, growing slowly, accumulating years and girth, and the hollow architecture that makes the oldest specimens seem like wooden cathedrals, living structures large enough to stand within, to shelter beneath, to touch and feel the texture of bark that was already ancient when Rome fell. The yew's biology is strange. It does not form distinct annual rings like most trees, making radiocarbon dating uncertain, age calculation speculative. The tree grows in bursts rather than steady accumulation, adding wood unpredictably, sometimes not at all for decades, then suddenly expanding. the center hollows, destroying the early growth rings that would allow precise dating. Estimates for the oldest specimens rely on extrapolation, comparison with ewes of known age, assumptions about growth rates that might not apply to trees that old, that well established, that deep into their peculiar mode of existence. Does the tree know it is old? Does it experience time the way we do, as linear progression? Or is its consciousness, if we can call it consciousness, more cyclical, more seasonal, each year's growth and dormancy, basically identical to every previous year? No accumulation of memory or meaning, just the patient persistence of living tissue doing what living tissue does: photosynthesize, grow, store energy, respond to sun and rain. And the slow turn of seasons through centuries that to the tree might feel like days, might feel like nothing, might simply be what existence is when you're a you, and immortality is your nature rather than your aspiration. The alchemists loved you symbolism, the conjunction of opposites, poison and medicine, death and eternal life, the hermetic teaching that transformation requires dissolution, that new growth comes from decay. The hollow heart of the ancient you becomes a vessel, an empty center where something sacred can reside, where the absence becomes as important as the presence, where the tree teaches by what it's lost as much as by what endures. Modern conservation efforts try to protect the ancient yews, to prevent damage from visitors or construction, to ensure they survive another millennium. But the trees seem largely indifferent to our efforts, growing or not growing according to their own rhythms, rooted so deeply that storms that topple oaks barely trouble them, resistant to most diseases, poisonous enough that browsers leave them alone, simply enduring through whatever history brings. Whatever changes sweep across the human world that briefly flickers around their permanent presence. There is something consoling in this permanence, this vegetable resistance to the mortality that defines animal existence. We die, the you persists. Civilizations rise and fall, the you stands. Languages change, technologies transform. Entire worldviews dissolve and are replaced. The you continues its slow photosynthesis, its patient growth, its hollowing and self-renewal that makes it effectively immortal barring catastrophe. Is it alive in the way we understand life? It has no brain, no nervous system, no ability to move or change or act upon the world, except through the slow assertion of its growth. But it responds to environment, repairs damage, produces seeds that might grow into new trees, exists in relationship with fungi that help its roots absorb nutrients, with insects that pollinate its flowers, with birds that spread its seeds. It participates in the web of life, ancient and essential, holding space that has been sacred so long we've forgotten why it became sacred. Only knowing that it is, that these trees mark threshold spaces where ordinary time loosens its hold, where past and present coexist, where the deep patterns that underlie existence become momentarily visible to those patient enough to sit beneath the branches and simply be with the age of it, the weight of it, the impossible persistence of life that counted its first years when humans were barely civilized, when writing was new invention, when everything we call history was still future, still unfolding toward the present where the you stands, still growing, still alive, still teaching anyone who pays attention that time is longer and stranger than we imagine, that life finds forms we barely recognize, that sacred is what endures. Sleep now beneath the spreading branches, in the green shade that has sheltered seekers for millennia, in the presence of the tree that remembers nothing and forgets nothing, that simply is year after year, century after century, living embodiment of persistence, of the patience required to outlast empires, of the possibility that some things do not die, but continue, transformed but essentially themselves, hollow but still standing, poisonous but still holy, ancient beyond measure, but still, somehow, alive. Vesuvius loomed over the Bay of Naples, smoking gently, always smoking, the way it had smoked for generations, without significant threat. The people of Pompeii knew the mountain was volcanic tremors, occasionally rattled dishes. Minor earthquakes damaged buildings in 62 CE, but active, dangerous. The thought barely registered. Their attention was on commerce, on the thriving port, on the beautiful villas spreading across the hillsides, walls painted with gardens that extended impossible perspectives, with mythological scenes rendered in colors that still stun us nearly 2,000 years later. August 24, 79 CE, or possibly October, the dating is disputed. The eruption came suddenly, catastrophically, though not without warning. Minor quakes intensified, springs and wells went dry, animals behaved strangely. Then the mountain exploded, sending superheated gas and pulverized rock 20 miles into the sky. The column visible from Rome, blocking the sun, turning day to darkness. Pompeii was not destroyed by lava. Instead, pyroclastic surges, avalanches of hot gas and ash swept down the mountain at 100-mile-per-hour speeds, killing instantly, then burying the city in layers of pumice and ash that hardened into rock, sealing buildings, bodies, artwork, everyday objects into a time capsule that would wait 17 centuries before being excavated. The bodies themselves dissolved over centuries, leaving voids in the hardened ash. Archaeologists discovered these cavities could be filled with plaster, creating casts of the victims in their final moments. A family huddled together, a dog chained and struggling against restraints. Individuals caught running, cowering, attempting futile protection. The casts show clothing, facial features, the terrible intimacy of last movements preserved in negative space, in absence that becomes presence through careful reconstruction. But the paintings survived directly. Pigment and plaster preserved beneath ash, protected from wind and rain, and the slow degradation that claims most ancient artwork. When excavation began in earnest in the 18th century, workers uncovered frescoes of breathtaking sophistication, portraits that seemed to meet your eyes, still lifes of fruit, so realistic you could reach for them, architectural illusions that make walls seem to dissolve into fictive gardens. The technique was fresco pigment applied to wet plaster, becoming chemically bonded to the wall as the plaster cures, creating colors that, if protected from weathering, can last millennia. The Pompeians mastered this art, decorating not just public buildings and wealthy villas, but ordinary houses, shops, even brothels with painted walls that transformed interior space into theaters of imagination. In the Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the city proper, a room contains a continuous frieze depicting what might be Dionysian mystery rites. Women and satyrs, divine figures, and human initiates engaged in ceremony we cannot fully interpret. The figures are life-sized, painted against a dramatic red background, Pompeian red, a color that became synonymous with the city, with luxury, with the aesthetic ambitions of Roman elite. The woman preparing for marriage, or perhaps for mystical initiation. The dancing Maenad, her robes swirling. Dionysus himself, reclining in divine indifference while human drama unfolds around him. The frightened initiate kneeling, awaiting revelation or ordeal. Each figure rendered with psychological complexity, with attention to gesture and expression that suggests the artist understood not just how bodies look, but how they feel, how posture reveals emotion, how the sacred and human intersect. These paintings survived burial because burial protected them, but exposure has become their slow executioner. The moment air reaches the frescoes, degradation begins. Moisture cycling through the plaster, salts crystallizing and expanding, biological growth, algae, fungi, bacteria feeding on organic components in the ancient pigments. Light fades certain colors, ultraviolet radiation breaking down chemical bonds. Tourists breathing in enclosed spaces increase humidity. Touching walls leave oils that attract contaminants. The irony is cruel. We excavate to preserve, to study, to appreciate. But excavation begins destruction. Some of the most spectacular paintings documented in early excavations have already faded significantly, their colors less vibrant, details less clear. Photographs from the 19th century show paintings that now barely exist, their imagery bleeding into indistinction as chemistry and time work their inevitable alchemy. Conservators wage careful battle against entropy, controlling humidity, limiting visitor access, applying consolidants to crumbling plaster, using lasers to clean without abrasion, monitoring environmental conditions with sensors. But they cannot stop the process, only slow it. The paintings that survived Vesuvius, that endured 1,700 years of darkness, might not survive 200 years of admiration. Some sections have been closed, indefinitely too fragile for visitation, too valuable to risk. They rest in carefully controlled darkness, as they did before excavation. Preservation through isolation, through returning to the sealed state that protected them initially. We have photographs, detailed surveys, 3D scans, but the experience of standing before the original, of seeing the colors as Romans saw them, that becomes increasingly restricted, eventually perhaps forbidden entirely. And beneath Pompeii, beneath Herculaneum, beneath the other towns buried by Vesuvius, more paintings wait. Archaeology proceeds slowly now, carefully, with the knowledge that excavation is destruction's beginning. Better to leave some treasures buried, sealed in their volcanic tomb, than to expose them to air and light, and the admiration that becomes consumption, appreciation that becomes diminishment. The villa of the papyri in Herculaneum contains a library, hundreds of scrolls, carbonized by heat, but potentially readable using advanced imaging. The villa is largely unexcavated, sealed beneath 20 meters of volcanic rock harder than concrete. To reach, it requires tunnels, impossible expense, and the certainty that whatever is found will immediately begin deteriorating once exposed. So it waits, the only intact ancient Roman library ever discovered, resting in the darkness, holding texts that might include lost works of Aristotle, of Epicurus, of Roman poets and philosophers we know only by name or by fragments quoted in later sources. Should we dig? Should we leave it sealed? The debate continues, weighted with the knowledge that either choice involves loss. The loss of knowing if we leave it buried, the loss of preservation if we excavate. There are no good options, only trade-offs between curiosity and conservation, between present knowledge and future possibility. The paintings on Pompeii's walls teach us about Roman aesthetics, social life, religious practice, mythology, daily existence in ways written sources cannot. They show us what Romans valued in decoration, how they used art to transform domestic space, what stories they wanted surrounding them in their homes. They preserve the hands of artists whose names we'll never know, whose skill rivaled any modern painter, whose understanding of color and composition and psychological realism demonstrates that technical achievement in art is not progressive, that ancient artists could do anything we can do. They simply did it with different materials, different subjects, different contexts. But perhaps the painting's greatest teaching is about transience, about the fragility of beauty, about how easily color fades and detail dissolves, how preservation requires perfect conditions, darkness, stable temperature, low humidity, the absence of the very things humans bring: breath, presence, the desire to see and touch and be close to what moves us. Sleep now, with the image of garden frescoes extending walls into fictive paradise, painted birds frozen mid-flight, painted flowers that never wilt, landscapes that never change, though the paint that creates them slowly surrenders to chemistry and time, fading into ghosts of images, into suggestions of what was, into the memory of beauty that survives in photographs and descriptions, but not in direct experience, not in the overwhelming presence of color and composition that Romans knew, that early excavators witnessed, that grows fainter each year, each decade, teaching us that nothing lasts forever, that even the most protected treasures eventually return to earth, to dust, to the silence from which they briefly emerged to show us what humans can create when they turn their attention to beauty, to decoration, to making the spaces they inhabit into theaters of imagination, into reflections of how they wished the world could be colorful, harmonious, filled with gardens that never end and gods who still walk among mortals, who still care what happens in the painted rooms where ordinary people lived their ordinary lives, briefly, beautifully, until the mountains spoke and the world they knew dissolved in fire and ash, and the long preservation of burial that we've disturbed, that we're slowly destroying through the very act of appreciating, of studying, of trying to hold onto what time insists we must let go. somewhere beyond the lands of Islam, beyond the territories mapped by Christian knowledge, there existed, so the story went, a Christian kingdom of impossible virtue and wealth. Its ruler was Prester John, simultaneously priest and king, defender of the faith in realms where Christians were besieged, holder of treasures that defied imagination, living in a palace of crystal and precious stones, protected by armies commanded through a magical mirror that showed him threats from any distance. The legend first appears in the 12th century, spreading rapidly through Europe like wildfire across dry grass. Everyone who heard it believed it, or wanted to believe it, needed to believe that somewhere in the vast hostile world, Christian civilization flourished, that they were not alone, not surrounded by enemies, that divine providence had established a second Christendom to balance their own. In 1165, a letter supposedly written by Prester John to the Byzantine emperor was circulated widely through European courts. It described wonders, rivers flowing with emeralds, stones that burned with their own light, providing illumination without flame, fountains of youth restoring the elderly to their prime. The kingdom contained the 10 lost tribes of Israel, penitent and Christian now, living in harmony with Prester John's subjects. The letter described military victories against Muslim armies, hinted at plans to come to Jerusalem's aid, to restore the Holy Land to Christian rule. The letter was almost certainly a forgery, probably created by European Christians to bolster morale during the Crusades, but it worked because it spoke to deep needs. The need for allies, for evidence that God's favor extended beyond besieged Europe, for proof that Christian civilization could thrive, could achieve the earthly paradise that seemed impossible in the corruption and violence of medieval Christendom. Explorers set out to find Prester John. Portuguese sailors pushed down the African coast, partly motivated by the hope of reaching his kingdom, of forming alliance against Muslim powers that controlled the Mediterranean. Every rumor was investigated. Every traveler's tale about distant Christian communities interpreted as possible evidence. Marco Polo's accounts of Central Asian kingdoms were scrutinized for hints. Ethiopian Christians, isolated from Rome by Muslim expansion, were proposed as Prester John's people. Though Ethiopia proved decidedly real rather than mythical Christian, yes, but not fabulously wealthy, not ruled by priest kings with magical powers. The myth persisted for centuries, the kingdom's location shifting on maps as each proposed site proved barren of the expected paradise. Central Asia gave way to Africa, then to more remote regions still. As the world became explored, as blank spaces on maps filled with actual geography, the kingdom retreated further, always just beyond current knowledge, always in the next unexplored territory. Why did people need Prester John to exist? Partly for geopolitical reasons, a Christian ally behind Muslim territories would provide strategic advantage, would allow coordinated attacks that could relieve pressure on crusader states. But more fundamentally, the myth served psychological and spiritual needs. Evidence that Christian virtue could produce earthly reward, that faith led not just to heaven, but to prosperity, power, harmony here on earth. Medieval Europe was poor, violent, disease-ridden, ruled by brutal necessity. The contrast with Prester John's reported kingdom, where justice reigned perfectly, where poverty did not exist, where gold and gems were so abundant they held no value, offered hope that somewhere virtue was rewarded, that the suffering of this world was not universal, that Christian ideals could manifest in actual society rather than merely in theological promise. The letter described Prester John's palace: floors of onyx, ceilings of ebony, tables of emerald and amethyst, pillars of precious stones holding up roofs that never needed repair. Guards were unnecessary because crime did not exist. Subjects were so virtuous they policed themselves. Meals were served on golden platters by attendants who appeared and disappeared according to need, possibly magical, possibly merely reflecting palace efficiency that exceeded European imagination. It reads like wish fulfillment, like medieval fan fiction about Christian civilization, if it could realize its stated values rather than constantly betraying them. And perhaps that's exactly what it was: not deliberate deception, but collective dream. Myth that helped people endure by suggesting that elsewhere someone had achieved what they could not, that the ideals they professed were not impossible, but merely not yet realized here, in this place, in this corrupt now. The myth influenced exploration significantly. The Portuguese obsession with circumnavigating Africa, with finding sea routes to India, was partly commercial, but also partly crusading. Find Prester John, form alliance, attack Muslim kingdoms from two directions, restore Jerusalem. The age of exploration was driven not just by gold and spices, but by this persistent myth, by the dream of discovering a Christian paradise that would validate European faith, that would prove that their religion led to earthly as well as heavenly kingdoms. As exploration proceeded, as Africa was mapped, as Asian kingdoms revealed themselves to be Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim rather than mysteriously Christian, the myth finally collapsed. By the 17th century, even the most credulous admitted Prester John did not exist, had never existed, was legend rather than geography. But what did exist was Ethiopian Christianity, and Jesuit missionaries who reached Ethiopia in the 16th century tried to claim that this was Prester John's kingdom, that the myth had been distorted transmission of reality. Ethiopia was Christian, had been since the 4th century, had maintained faith despite isolation. Its rulers could claim descent from Solomon and Sheba, had churches carved from solid rock, maintained ancient texts and rituals that European Christianity had abandoned or never known. But Ethiopia was poor, at least by European standards. Its churches were not crystal palaces. Its rulers did not possess magical mirrors or fountains of youth. It was real, which meant it was mortal, flawed, human. Everything Prester John's kingdom was supposed to transcend. Perhaps that's the lesson. Our need for impossible perfection somewhere else, for kingdoms that don't exist because they cannot exist, for the belief that someone, somewhere has solved the problems we cannot solve, has created the society we cannot create. We map these desires onto unknown territories, into blank spaces on charts, And as the blank spaces fill with actual geography, with real places populated by real humans facing real constraints, the myth retreats, looking for new blanks, new unknowns where it can hide from the disenchanting knowledge that everywhere is like everywhere else, that human nature is human nature, that virtue and vice mix in every society, that perfection is not achieved, but only imagined. The maps that once showed Prester John's kingdom now show what actually exists. Deserts and mountains, rivers and kingdoms that trade and war and change leadership, that have histories as complex and morally ambiguous as European history, that are neither paradises nor wildernesses, but something in between, something human, something real. Sleep now, with the image of old maps showing territories marked, here be dragons, or Prester John's kingdom, both equally mythical, both serving to populate the unknown with imagination, with fear or hope projected onto spaces that could not yet contradict the projection. Sleep with the understanding that we still do this, still imagine perfect societies just beyond current reach, still need to believe that somewhere virtue reigns and justice is natural and abundance is universal, that someone has solved what we cannot solve, that the future or the past or the unexplored contains what the present demonstrably lacks. The kingdom was never found because it was never geographical, it was psychological, spiritual, a map of desires rather than territories, a navigation chart pointing not to actual destination, but to the human need to believe that somewhere, somehow, the way things are is not the way things have to be, that paradise is possible, that faith and virtue can create earthly kingdoms, if only we could find them, if only we knew the way, if only the map we're following corresponded to reality, rather than reflecting back our own unmet longings, our own desperate hope that beyond the horizon, beyond the next mountain range, beyond the territories we know, something better waits, something perfect, something finally real. The North Sea is patient and hungry. For centuries it has gnawed at England's eastern coast, claiming land grain by grain, cliffall by cliffall, sometimes slowly through gradual erosion, sometimes suddenly in storms that reshape the shoreline overnight. And nowhere has it fed more steadily than on the medieval city of Dunwich, once a thriving port, once one of England's largest settlements, now reduced to a single street, a pub, a church, and vast silence where city used to be. In its heyday 12th and 13th centuries, Dunwich rivaled London in commercial importance. Ships from the continent docked at its wharves. Merchants traded wool and grain. Fish were salted and shipped across the known world. The city possessed 9 churches, several monasteries, a mint producing coins, guild halls and markets, a hospital, a leper colony maintaining proper distance from the main settlement. Estimates suggest population of perhaps 5,000 substantial for medieval England, a true urban center rather than rural village. The churches were the glory. All Saints, St. Peter's, St. John's, St. Nicholas, St. Leonard's, St. Martin's, St. Bartholomew's, St. Michael's, and the Church of the Blessed Virgin Mary, each with its tower, its bells, its congregation, its saints' days and processions, creating a soundscape of liturgical hours, of ringing that marked time and called the faithful, that declared this city's prosperity and devotion. But the coast was unstable. Shingle banks that protected the harbor shifted, sometimes driven by storm, sometimes through the slow accumulation of longshore drift. As the banks moved, the harbor silted, becoming less useful for large vessels. Trade declined, and the cliffs soft glacial, till mixed with sand crumbled steadily under wave assault. By 1286, storms were taking buildings. A single night could claim streets, churches toppling as the ground beneath them collapsed, sliding into the sea with bell towers and graves, and all the accumulated holiness of generations. The city retreated inland, rebuilding further from the cliff edge, but the sea followed, relentless, patient, claiming what was rebuilt, making temporary every structure, every street, every claim humans made on this shifting ground. Records document the losses. St. Leonard's fell to the waves in 1331. St. Martin's followed soon after. The Church of St. Nicholas toppled in 1328, its graveyard spilling bones and tombstones onto the beach below. All Saints, the largest church, held on until 1904. Its ruins visible on the beach at low tide, until even those stones were scattered by winter storms. The legend, and it is legend, though based in fact, claims that when storms sweep the coast, you can hear the bells of drowned Dunwich tolling beneath the waves, calling to services that will never be held, marking hours that have no meaning underwater, continuing their sacred purpose despite the sea that claimed them. It's almost certainly not true. Bells would have been salvaged if there was warning, removed to inland churches before buildings fell. And bronze does not ring properly underwater, the physics don't allow it. But the legend persists because it should be true, because something needs to mark what was lost, because the silence of absence needs filling with imagined sound, with bells that refuse to accept drowning, that continue their witness beneath the waves. What's certain is the ongoing loss. Even now, each year claims more ground. Archaeologists race against erosion, excavating what they can before it tumbles to the beach. Medieval coins, pottery, building foundations, graves. Sometimes storms expose ruins temporarily, allowing brief documentation before the next tide scatters the evidence. It's desperate work, partial at best, knowing that most of medieval Dunwich is already dissolved, its materials redistributed along the coastline, its stones ground to sand, its timbers long since rotted, its metal corroded to stains in the sediment. What did they think, the medieval citizens, watching their churches fall? Did they interpret it as divine punishment, as evidence of sin requiring penance? Did they understand the geological processes? Probably not in modern terms, but they knew the sea was winning, knew their city was dying by degrees, knew that children born there might not live their whole lives in the same location, that the town would shift inland or simply disperse, its population fleeing to more stable ground. Some stayed despite the risk. Always some stay, attached to place, even when place is demonstrably impermanent, even when every reasonable calculation suggests departure. Human stubbornness or human faith, the line between them blurs. By 1600, Dunwich was already ghost town, bypassed by trade, its harbor useless, its population reduced to a fraction of its medieval peak. The sea had won, was winning still, would continue winning as long as waves broke against soft cliffs, and time continued its patient work. Today, you can walk the single street of modern Dunwich, visit the museum that documents what's been lost, look at maps showing the medieval city extending far into what is now sea. At low tide, you can walk the beach and find fragments, worked stones, bits of pottery, occasionally bones from medieval graves tumbling from the cliff face. The sea continues its slow work, claiming a few meters more each decade, promising that eventually even the current village will fall, that the pattern of retreat will continue until there's no ground left to retreat to, until the sea reaches some more stable formation, or simply pushes the remnant population far enough inland that the name Dunwich will refer to somewhere entirely different from where it started. There's something almost peacefully inevitable about it, not catastrophe, but slow erasure, not dramatic, but grinding, not newsworthy, but patient. The sea does what seas do. The land responds as soft land must. Humans build and rebuild and retreat and eventually abandon, accepting limits, acknowledging that some battles cannot be won, that some processes overwhelm human resistance. Other villages along the same coast have vanished completely. Shipton, Walberswick, old Covehythe names in medieval records, locations now entirely underwater, leaving no trace except documentation, except the memory of communities that thought themselves as permanent as any settlement feels from within its own time. What haunts about Dunwich is not the loss, but the documentation of loss, the fact that we know what fell, can name the churches and count the streets, can map what no longer exists with precision that makes the absence more palpable. Most lost cities leave no record, simply vanish into archaeology's educated guesses. Dunwich left records, left maps, left the ability to know exactly what we've lost and to watch the loss continuing, to understand that what remains is temporary, current village is merely the next iteration in a long retreat that will not stop, that cannot be stopped by anything humans might build or pray or attempt. The bells do not ring beneath the waves, but they should. Some memorial needs to mark the drowned streets, the scattered stones, the dissolved lives that thrived here, loved here, built here, buried their dead here, thought their city would endure. The bells in imagination toll more truly than silence, marking a loss that continues, acknowledging what the sea claims and keeps claiming, ringing for services that ended centuries ago, but that the collective memory insists on continuing, refuses to let vanish entirely into the quiet forgetting that claims most human endeavor. Sleep now, with the sound of waves against cliffs, with the image of church towers sliding into the sea, with the tolling of bells that exist only in legend and longing, marking time that has no meaning underwater, calling to congregations long dispersed, insisting through imagination on a permanence that reality denied, that the sea denied, that time denies, but that memory preserves, partial and distorted and beautiful in its insistence, its refusal to accept that what is gone is truly gone, that what the waves took cannot somehow, in dream, in story, in the bells we imagine hearing, be kept, be remembered, be given the memorial that continuing sound provides testament to what was, to what we lost, to what we will continue losing as long as seas rise and coasts erode, and human settlements prove temporary against the patient hunger of water that claims everything. Eventually, everything except the stories we tell, the bells we imagine, the sound we create to fill the silence of what's been taken, what's been dissolved, what rings now only in the space between memory and myth, between history and hope, between what was real and what we need to imagine was real in order to mark its passing with something more than simple forgetting. In southeastern Turkey, on a hillside that overlooks the Mesopotamian plain, stones emerge from the earth. They have always been here, buried deliberately 10,000 years ago, hidden by the very people who created them, for reasons we can only speculate about. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it rewrites what we thought we knew about human civilization's origins, about when we became builders of temples, about what drove our ancestors to create monuments before they had learned to farm, before they had settled in permanent villages, before the invention of pottery or metalworking, or any of the technologies we thought necessary for complex society. The megaliths are T-shaped pillars, some as tall as 18 feet, weighing up to 20 tons. They stand in circles, roughly 20 people across, concentric arrangements of stone suggesting gathering, suggesting ceremony, suggesting purpose that required communal effort on scales we didn't imagine possible for Neolithic hunter-gatherers. The pillars are carved. Foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, snakes, wild boar's animals rendered with enough detail to identify species, arranged in panels across the stone's face, sometimes in relief that projects from the surface, sometimes incised into it. Some pillars show human arms, hands, suggesting these T-shapes might represent stylized human figures, perhaps gods, perhaps ancestors, perhaps categories we have no words for. What do these images mean? We cannot know. No Rosetta Stone bridges the gap between the symbols and our understanding. The carvings might be totems, clan markers, mythological narratives, astronomical notations, decorative art, sacred texts, any or all of these, or something else entirely, something that fit within their worldview but has no equivalent in ours. The structures were not living spaces. No hearths, no food debris, no evidence of habitation. People came here but did not stay, gathered for something ritual, ceremony, seasonal celebration, then departed. The effort required to build these circles would have been enormous. Quarrying the megaliths from bedrock using stone tools, dragging them up the hillside, erecting them without metal, without draft animals, without wheels, using only human muscle, wooden levers, ropes, and an organizational capacity we didn't believe existed in 9,000 BC. Why here? The location is not particularly strategic, not rich in natural resources, not obviously sacred, but something called them. Something insisted that this hillside required monument. That effort needed to be invested in creating sacred space, permanent structures that would outlast their builders. would mark this ground as different, as holy, as threshold. And then, after centuries of use, we think the circles were built and used over several hundred years. They buried it, deliberately, carefully, filling the circles with soil and rubble, covering the pillars completely, creating the hill that archaeological surveys first noticed in the 1960s, that excavation revealed starting in 1995, that continues to yield structures as each season's digging exposes more circles, more pillars, more carvings. Why bury it? Theories proliferate. Ritual closure, making way for new sites, preserving something too sacred to abandon, but too dangerous to leave exposed. Or perhaps the knowledge of its purpose was lost, the rituals forgotten, and later generations simply covered what they no longer understood, respected it enough to preserve it, but couldn't maintain practices whose meanings had dissolved. The implications for human history are profound. For most of the 20th century, the narrative was clear. Agriculture came first, creating surplus that allowed settlement, which led to specialization, which eventually enabled monument building, writing, civilization. Göbekli Tepe reverses this. The monuments came first. The religious impulse preceded the economic. Humans built temples before they built permanent houses, devoted resources to sacred architecture before they learned to farm. Perhaps religion drove agriculture. Perhaps the need to feed pilgrims gathering for ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe and similar sites forced the invention of farming, the domestication of wheat and barley, the transition from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture. We've found evidence of early grain cultivation in the region, of wild plants in transition to domesticated forms, suggesting experimentation with agriculture precisely in this time and place. It's a stunning reversal. Not bread creating God, but God creating bread. Not economic necessity driving social complexity, but spiritual need, existential questioning, the hunger to mark sacred space and gather in its presence, driving the innovations that would transform human existence. Excavation continues slowly, carefully. Ground-penetrating radar suggests 20 or more circles still buried. potentially hundreds more T-shaped pillars waiting beneath the soil. Each circle exposed requires years of work, documentation, conservation, analysis. The site could yield discoveries for decades, each season adding details, complicating rather than simplifying the picture. What rituals happened here? What did they believe, these people with sophisticated symbolic thinking, but no written language to tell us? What needs drove them to such monumental effort to create structures that served no practical purpose, that provided no shelter or storage, that existed purely for ceremony, for marking sacred time and sacred space? The carvings might be hints. The prevalence of predator species lions, foxes, snakes might suggest shamanic practices. Identification with animal spirits, ceremonies of transformation or protection. The vultures appear frequently, birds associated with death and sky burial, practices where corpses were exposed to be cleaned by carrion birds before bones were interred. Did Göbekli Tepe host such rituals? Are there bodies buried here we haven't found? Or were the dead processed elsewhere, the bones brought here for secondary burial or memorial? The human-shaped pillars with arms, do they represent deities, mythical ancestors, idealized humans? Are the circles gathering around these figures showing devotion or community? Or are the T-shapes abstract, symbolizing concepts rather than beings? Ideas we don't have language for because they emerged from a worldview completely alien to our own. Standing among the excavated circles, looking at the megaliths rising from ancient bedrock, carved with animals that still roam these hills or have since vanished, it's impossible not to feel the weight of unknowing, the profound humility that archaeology demands. We can date the stones, analyze tool marks, reconstruct the labor required, but the meaning, the why that drove all this effort remains locked in the minds that conceived it, buried more deeply than the stones themselves. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries should remain mysteries. Some questions should persist without answers. Göbekli Tepe teaches us that human impulse toward the sacred is ancient beyond imagining, that our ancestors asked the same questions we ask about existence, meaning, what lies beyond death, how to mark the significant, how to create permanent expressions of temporary insights, and that they answered those questions in stone and ceremony, in gatherings that happened 10,000 years ago, using symbols whose meanings have dissolved entirely, leaving us only the evidence of their asking, the proof of their caring, the testament that humans have always needed more than bread, have always created sacred spaces, and invested enormous effort in marking certain places, certain times, certain gatherings as holy. The door they carved leads nowhere we can follow. The names inscribed in symbols we cannot read might be gods or people or concepts that existed only in their shared understanding, their collective myth. But the door stands, the pillars remain, the circles can be walked, and in walking them, in standing among the megaliths, we join a continuity that stretches back 10 millennia humans in sacred space, asking sacred questions, creating monuments to mark our wondering, our not knowing, our persistent sense that existence means something more than survival, that consciousness deserves temples, that the mysteries we cannot solve still deserve honor, still demand our best efforts at expression, even when words fail and symbols outlast their meanings. And all we can leave is stone shaped with devotion, oriented toward questions whose answers we could not find, but whose asking we insisted must be marked, must be remembered, must be given permanent form, so that whoever comes after you, me, the archaeologists with their tools, will know that we were here, that we wondered, that we built these circles and carved these stones and then buried them, preserving what we created even though we could not preserve what it meant, leaving you this gift of mystery, this invitation to stand where we stood and feel what we felt and wonder what we wondered, in the presence of the sacred, in the shadow of the stones, in the silence where forgotten names still echo, if you listen with something deeper than ears, with the part of you that recognizes without understanding, that knows without knowing, that the door marked with symbols you cannot read still opens onto something real, something that mattered to them and matters still, in the space between what we know and what we will never know, where mystery lives. The end rest now. The mysteries wait in their silence, patient as stone, asking nothing, offering everything the gift of wonder, the peace of not knowing, the comfort of questions that need no answers, only acknowledgement. Sleep well among the stories of forgotten things. Morning will bring its own light, its own concerns. For now, let the ancient silences hold you. Let the mysteries keep their secrets. Let yourself drift into the same darkness that holds lost libraries and drowned bells, sealed chambers and hidden names, all the beautiful uncertainty that makes existence mysterious, makes the past a dream we cannot quite remember, makes the present a threshold between what we've lost and what endures. Sleep.